Hello, everyone. I hope you're enjoying your lunch. It's been a while since we've had lunch at these talks. I'm Jocelyn Kennedy. I'm the Executive Director of the Law Library. It's my sort of great pleasure to welcome you here to our book talk. I'm thrilled that you're here. Copies of The Last Days of Stalin are for sale at the back of the room, so if you'd like to buy a copy. And Professor Rubenstein will be on hand afterwards to sign copies of the book. Just to let you know, today's presentation is being recorded by the law school, as will the question and answer period of our program. The recording should be available later this week or next week on the law school's YouTube channel. I'm going to now turn over the program to Professor Alford, who will be doing our introductions. Professor Alford is the Vice Dean for the Graduate Program in International Legal Studies, among many other roles he plays here at the law school.
Thank you, Jocelyn. We're very appreciative of Jocelyn and the library for working with East Asian Legal Studies and the Data Center to put this on. So it's my pleasure to introduce the program today. So Josh Rubenstein is a person who leads at least 3 lives. He was the head of Amnesty International for the Northeast U.S., New England, New York, New Jersey for almost 37 years. I was going to say a quarter century. 37 years. He's Associate Director of Major Gifts at Harvard Law School, and he also, as you will learn today, is an extraordinarily accomplished scholar of Soviet affairs. He's done a number of books about the Soviet Union. My favorite, my favorite book, not person, necessarily, Leon Trotsky, a book about Ehrenberg, a book about Stalin's secret pogroms, a book about KGB files and Sakharov. And the books are extraordinary. I have to admit, I didn't initially plan to read the entire Stalin book, but I started and I couldn't put it down. You learn in this book everything from Stalin having webbed feet on one foot, his toes merged together, to the exact percentage of Jewish musicians playing in the Hall of Columns when his body lay there. It was not 95%, as the accusations had it, but 35.7%, down to big things like President Eisenhower missing perhaps an opportunity with Stalin's death to make greater inroads about the Cold War. So we're thrilled to have Josh. I want to thank also my colleague Alonzo Emery for doing all the creative work to put this together. And our commentator today is my fond, dear professor from Amherst College, who inspired me to become an academic, Bill Taubman. So Bill Taubman is both a great scholar and a great teacher. He wrote the book about Khrushchev that won the Pulitzer Prize and several other major awards. He has a book coming next fall about Gorbachev, and we hope to have him back to speak about Gorbachev. He was an undergraduate at Harvard, did his doctoral work at Columbia, and is just a masterful scholar, but also, as I mentioned before, an inspiring teacher. It's my privilege to be in his seminar when I was a mere sophomore, I think it was, at Amherst College, and to see the excitement he radiated about learning. I also want to acknowledge Professor Jane Taubman, also professor of Russian Studies at Amherst. Both Bill and Jane now emeritus, but still very, very active intellectually. So with that, let me turn the floor over to Josh.
Thank you all. Is this working?
Turn this off.
Thank you all for joining us. I want to especially thank Bill Alford, Alonzo Emery, our friends from the Law Library, June, and others for inviting me and setting this all up. And many of my colleagues from the Alumni Center are here, and it's very nice of all of you to join us too. I want to start by showing the photographs from the book as a way to kind of do a cursory summary of many of the themes in the book, and give you a visual history of what we're talking about. This is an image from 1947 of the Politburo. And you see Stalin in the center, and to your left, the man in the eyeglasses, the pince nez, Lavrenti Beria, the longtime security chief, a particularly loathsome figure. Next to him is, in the front row, is Lazar Kaganovich, the only Jew who remained at the Politburo at that level of power. And then Georgy Malenkov, And then to Stalin's immediate right in the front row is Vyacheslav Molotov, the famous foreign minister, especially famous in the lead up to World War II and during World War II. And then to Stalin's left in the front row is Voroshilov, who was a famous army commander who was notoriously incompetent, who was relieved of virtually all command authority, but nonetheless remained in the Politburo. But I want to emphasize the presence of two gentlemen just behind Stalin. Over Stalin's right shoulder is Alexei Kuznetsov, and over Stalin's left shoulder is Nikolai Voznesensky. Now, I mention them here. They are members of the Politburo. They like to all refer to themselves as Stalin's comrades in arms. That was the phrase they liked to use. I emphasize these two gentlemen because they were both arrested within 2 years and summarily executed. Stalin retained the right to kill until the end of his own life. And all of his most closest collaborators, members of the Politburo, understood they were not only his close comrades, but they were all his potential victims. This is from January of 1952 to commemorate Lenin's death. And again, you see the array of leaders with Stalin in the center, and going away from Stalin's right, Malenkov, Voroshilov, and all the way to the left, our left, is Nikita Khrushchev. A year later, when Stalin died, Western leaders had no appreciation of who Khrushchev was, and Eisenhower referred to him as this little-known figure. So Western intelligence and understanding of the Soviet leadership was very faulty, partly because, of course, the system was opaque. And so it was hard to get hard intelligence of what was really going on all the time at that level of power. But they're arranged in a particular hierarchy, and that's very important. Whoever's closer to Stalin means they exercise greater authority and power within the ruling circle. And this is repeated after Stalin's death. This is a picture of Stalin at the 19th Party Congress in Moscow in October 1952, his last public address. Stalin used to give the principal speeches at these conferences beginning in the mid-1920s, and they would go on for several hours. He was no longer physically up to the task. He only spoke for about 8 or 9 minutes that day. And the others took that as a sign of his faltering health. Malenkov delivered the principal address of the Central Committee, as it was called. He spoke for over 5 hours. That was not something Stalin was able to do at that point. This is another picture from the conference. It was not published because it shows Stalin in not such a heroic pose. So that would not have been allowed to be published in the Soviet press. Now, one of the major episodes in the last months of Stalin's life was the doctor's plot. On January 13th, 1953, one of many episodes of anti-Jewish campaigning in the Soviet Union, in the Soviet press, was the doctor's plot. On January 13th, it was announced that a conspiracy of doctors, including many prominent Jewish physicians, had been exposed, and they were trying to compromise the health of Soviet leaders, even lead to their killing. And they were said to be in cahoots with Western imperialism, with Zionists, and with the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, a very famous international Jewish welfare organization. They always referred to it as the Joint, in some kind of sinister way. So this is a photograph, a caricature that appeared at the end of January in Krokodil, the leading Soviet satirical magazine. And you can see that underneath the image of a benign professor type, you see the true image of a Jewish predator, with stereotypical images very, very similar to what the Nazis used just several years earlier. And this is the kind of imagery that animated the Soviet press in the last weeks of Stalin's life surrounding the doctor's plot. And it's something I discuss a great deal in the book. Now, Stalin died on the night of March 5th. His death is announced the next day in the Soviet press. Typically, he's in a commanding pose, Napoleon-like. Everything is airbrushed in this photograph. His hair was no longer so full, much grayer. He looked much older. But of course, this is a heroic image that they wanted to project on the front page of Pravda with a medical bulletin confirming that he had died of natural causes. They wanted to reassure the population that he had not died as a result of some kind of conspiracy. And all the signatures of the doctors, none of them could be Jewish, in order to reassure the population that nothing sinister had happened. In Washington, D.C., on that same day, March 6th, a restaurant offered free borscht in honor of Stalin's death. Now, this is the first photograph to appear of Stalin's corpse. This is on March 7th. There are two things I want to point out about this, actually three things I want to point out about this photograph. First, the image of Stalin within the frame of the photograph is greatly enlarged. That is way out of proportion to the size of Stalin's corpse, but they wanted to project that image again of being a commanding figure, and that the others are so much smaller, they still derive all their authority from this dead person. Also, the proximity of people to Stalin's head reflects their place in the emerging hierarchy. So first you see Malenkov, then Beria, and Khrushchev is little known in the back between Kaganovich and Molotov in the back row. The third thing I'll point out is all the flowers. All the cut flowers in the country were requisitioned to be brought to Moscow to honor Stalin. The well-known Soviet composer Sergei Prokofiev died at virtually the same time in Moscow, that March 5th. There was no mention of that in the Soviet press, and at Prokofiev's funeral that week, there were virtually no flowers that could be found to honor him. This is just another photograph from the Hall of Columns in Moscow, how Stalin was laid out. And this is another photograph. Again, you see Stalin elevated in the image, and the other men, his heirs, arrayed face to face. Already Khrushchev seems to have been elevated a little bit on the right. He seems to be inching a little closer to Stalin, but they're eyeing each other, you know, sizing each other up. Who was going to be next? Who would succeed Stalin? Who would really grab power? These are the crowds in the streets. Stalin died on March 5th. Already in the afternoon of March 6th, his body was lying in state in the Hall of Columns, one of the central halls of Moscow. Thousands and hundreds of thousands of people went through the streets in order to view the body and mourn. Some people believe that the lines reached 8 miles outside of Moscow. The crowds were not controlled properly by troops and police. And we know that Khrushchev later admitted that well over 100 people were trampled to death. We think the figures are much higher, but we don't really know. As far as I know, no documents have been released to attest to what the full scale of the victims were. There were also victims in Leningrad and Tbilisi in Georgia as well. There's another picture of the lines of people in front of the Bolshoi Theater, which is just within blocks of the Hall of Columns. Just gives you a sense of what it was like on a very, very cold March day in Moscow. This is Svetlana Alliluyeva with her husband Yuri Zhdanov. To her right, our left, in the Hall of Columns. She just died recently, in a very troubled life, but she was a very intelligent, well-educated woman. This is his son Vasily, who was a complete drunk. He had been elevated, of course, because of his connection to his father, to be a leading figure in the Air Force. But he had no real authority. And he was arrested several months after Stalin's death. He died within a decade of cirrhosis of the liver. But he was there, of course, as the son of Stalin. This is the body being carried out to the ceremony. Again, you see in the front Beria on the right, Malenkov on the left. And here they are in the street, and I want to emphasize the presence of Zhou Enlai right in the middle. Zhou Enlai represented the Chinese government. Mao did not come to Moscow for the funeral, though Mao's wife was in Moscow already from the winter receiving medical treatment. Now, Zhou Enlai led an 18-person delegation to the funeral and was at no point asked to sit with or stand with or walk with other foreign diplomats. He was always with Soviet officials and given a very special status. At one point in the funeral proceedings, they asked Zhou Enlai to lead a certain group of people, and normally the Corps Dean, the leading diplomat, the most veteran foreign diplomat, who's called the Corps Dean, who is the Swedish ambassador, should have been in that position, but they said, no, Zhou Enlai goes first. And so they put in a diplomatic protest, and they had to ask Zhou Enlai to step down and let the Swedish ambassador take his rightful place. So everything was being orchestrated in terms of the hierarchy and authority and where you were in the among communist officials. This is in Prague. There were similar enormous crowds throughout Eastern Europe. This is what the crowd was like on the day of Stalin's funeral, March 9th, in Prague. According to news reports in Tirana, in Albania, Enver Hoxha, the communist dictator, ordered the entire population of Tirana to assemble in the central square, made them kneel, and for 2 hours recite a pledge of allegiance to Stalin. It was that kind of forced mourning for Stalin throughout Eastern Europe. Now, this photograph appeared on March 10th, the day after Stalin's funeral. So who do we see? We see Stalin. We see Mao, the head of the largest communist country, China. The revolution had only succeeded in the fall of 1949. And Georgy Malenkov in the typical Napoleonic pose. Now, what's amazing about this photograph is its complete fabrication. This is the real photograph from February of 1950. When the Sino-Soviet treaty was signed, you see Andrei Vyshinsky in the middle, signing the treaty. Malenkov is to his left, to our right, standing with his hand in front of his abdomen, Napoleon-like. Stalin is in the back, next to Mao. And this is how the picture appeared 3 years later in the Soviet press. Malenkov's colleagues were furious with him for relegating them to a memory hole. Stalin used to do that to his victims when he was already in the process of destroying them. But this was a collective leadership in the months and the days following Stalin's death. And the idea that Malenkov would do something so engineered, so transparent, to elevate himself angered the others. And so he was demoted in some certain ways in the weeks that followed. This is the last picture in the book. This is Eisenhower. Now, one of the main themes of the book is how Eisenhower, Dwight Eisenhower, the new president, and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, responded to Stalin's death. Eisenhower ran for office in the fall of 1952. He was inaugurated on January 20th. Churchill was in office, again, as prime minister. And Churchill was encouraging Eisenhower to go meet with Stalin, to try to diffuse these tensions in the early years of the Cold War. And even after Stalin died, Churchill continued to press Eisenhower and Foster Dulles to meet with the new Soviet leaders, maybe in Stockholm, maybe at some other neutral locality. And Eisenhower took it very seriously, but Foster Dulles was dead set against it. So on April 16th, just weeks after Stalin's death, Eisenhower gave one of his most famous speeches, the Chance for Peace speech, where he discussed how so much money is being spent on armaments that could be better spent on hospitals, on schools, on agricultural development for people everywhere, not just in the United States and the Soviet Union. It was his way of reaching out. 2 days later, Dulles spoke to the same audience, the American Society of Newspaper Editors in Washington, and adopted a completely different tone, a tone of belligerence. So what was the message? Well, what surprised Eisenhower and the Americans was a week or 8 days later, the Soviet press published Eisenhower's speech without any editing, including Eisenhower's criticism of Stalin for starting the Cold War, for the occupation of Eastern Europe. This was a clear signal by the new Soviet leaders that they were open to something, some kind of dialogue, some kind of negotiation. The American leadership was completely confused that the new Soviet leaders would publish Eisenhower's speech without editing, without ridicule, in the Soviet press. And they felt they were being manipulated rather than, in my view, taking this as a signal of serious intent on their part. I'd like to just read a couple of pages from the introduction, and then I'm very pleased Bill Taubman will be speaking. It's great having Bill with us as well to participate today. Joseph Stalin collapsed and died in an atmosphere of medieval recrimination. It was March 1953. The Kremlin seethed with fears of a broad new purge against members of his presidium. A public campaign against treasonous Jewish doctors threatened to engulf all of Soviet Jewry. Tensions with the West were more and more alarming. After 3 years of fighting, the war in Korea continued unabated, while American and Soviet armies faced each other in a divided Germany. At the same time, a new American administration led by President Dwight David Eisenhower and Secretary of State John Foster Dulles had come into office that January with the intention of rolling back communism, only to find themselves confronting Stalin's heirs and a host of unexpected reforms. At home and abroad, Stalin's longtime comrades in arms faced a host of difficult dilemmas. They understood the need to release prisoners from the Gulag. In fact, they released over 1 million prisoners within 3 weeks after Stalin's death. Disavow the doctor's plot and provide higher living standards for the population. They also offered concessions to the West, a dramatic peace offensive, as it was called, that included renewed and serious negotiations to end the fighting in Korea and reduce tensions in Europe, including in the satellite countries in Eastern Europe, where Stalin's extreme policies were leading to popular unrest against communist rule. But their overriding concern was preserving their hold on power. Stalin had so dominated life in the country that his death provoked an enormous outpouring of disoriented grief. And I'm quoting, "Stalin was inside everyone, like the hammer alongside the sickle in every mind," as the writer Andrei Sinyavsky wrote. The regime feared that his death would lead to panic and disorder, which is why they were afraid of all these enormous crowds in the street, which in turn could undermine their legitimacy and the authority of one-party rule. They had to devise a way to distance themselves from Stalin's crimes, while insisting that the Communist Party not be held responsible for the tyrant's brutality, that the party was more to be pitied for what it had endured than condemned for what it had applauded. This dilemma rose immediately after his collapse, then continued for decades, with occasional flashes of candor and truth, followed by renewed official respect for Stalin and his leadership. It affected his medical treatment, the conduct of his funeral, relations with the West, and everyday life in the country. This book opens with Stalin's death, moves backward in time to the 19th Party Congress in October '52, when Stalin made his last public speech, then proceeds through the winter of '52-'53, when the doctor's plot and a broad campaign against the country's Jews unfolded. It explores how the Soviet and American press covered Stalin's death and how the new Eisenhower administration reacted to the dramatic changes in Moscow that followed. It concludes with the arrest of Stalin's longtime security chief, Lavrentiy Beria, in June. As I like to say, the book opens happily, Stalin dies, and it closes happily, Beria is executed. Unlike any other book in Soviet history, it opens with a happy note and it closes with a happy note. Stalin's death introduced an unprecedented opportunity. It gave his heirs the chance to reverse many of his policies and move the country forward in a hopeful, more relaxed direction. It presented the United States with an urgent need to review assumptions about how it could work with a brutal and menacing dictatorship that had suddenly lost its leader and seemed ready to negotiate a new beginning to its relations with the outside world. For complex reasons, both Soviet and Western governments could not overcome the decades of mistrust that divided them. The arms race persisted, the division of Germany and Europe continued, the Cold War reached into far corners of the world, where tensions between East and West spilled over into proxy conflicts of untold misery and destruction. And in the Soviet Union, the promise of change that highlighted the initial months that followed Stalin's death collapsed into a pattern of exhilarating reform and disheartening repression that lasted until Mikhail Gorbachev pushed the limits of reform so far that the Soviet regime could no longer survive. Stalin's death gave the Kremlin and the West a chance to escape the grim reality of his nightmarish imagination, a challenge they failed to accomplish. That failure haunted the world for decades to follow. Thank you.
I'm going to try it. Is this working? No. Let's see. It says on. Hello? It's working. Good. Josh wrote a wonderful book, and I enjoyed his talk. You can see he's got a kind of enthusiasm and passion for his subject, which always helps when you're writing a book. What I'd like to try to do is to elaborate a bit in a somewhat academic way on the story that he told. I mean, elaborate both chronologically by taking the story further into the period of Khrushchev, whose biography I wrote, and Gorbachev, whose biography I've just written, but it won't be published until next fall. But I'd also like to elaborate, one might say conceptually, in the following sense. The last days of Stalin, obviously interesting and revealing in their own right, but particularly important because Stalin was a man who dominated his country, who shaped its politics, and it turned out that his own personality shaped his impact on his country. So it's not just the story of his last days, it's the story of the disappearance, the demise of a man which then opened the door, that is his departure, opened the door to change. Joss has talked about how the change began and then how it stalled and how it only was really culminated in the sense of reform and liberation when Gorbachev took over. But what I'd like to talk about is what enables us to say about a particular leader that he has or she has this kind of impact on their country, such that when they disappear, all bets are off, all doors are open, everything can at least theoretically change. And then I'll talk a little bit more specifically about Khrushchev and Gorbachev as the story continues. Well, let me point out three characteristics of a leader which enable us to say, as I just said, that he or she has this kind of impact. One, when a leader has the kind of incredible, almost unlimited power that Stalin had. You may say all leaders have great power, and they do, but some leaders have more power than others. And Stalin is the classic example of a dictator with almost unlimited power in a country where there were no constraints really on him before and even less during his reign. No separation of powers, no constitution, no free press, no political parties, nothing except a tradition of authoritarian rule which he turned into totalitarian rule. Now, Khrushchev and Gorbachev had less power than Stalin did, but they still had, I would argue, more power than most American presidents. This is an interesting subject which we might debate. But I think they both had particular power because they were leaders of the only party, the Communist Party, which dominated the life of the country. Now, secondly, another characteristic of leaders which I think allows us to say that they have the kind of impact they do, that impact is related to their personality, and that when they disappear, all bets are off. When you have a leader who does things, who is unique in his or her behavior and policies, that is to say, when you can argue, this is never a proof, scientific proof, but when you can argue that other leaders in their stead would not do what they did, that they do things that are unique, idiosyncratic. Now you may say, how do you know this? Well, you don't for sure, but I'll give you three examples: Stalin, Khrushchev, and Gorbachev. Stalin was surrounded from 1917 on, even before, by men, Bolsheviks, who were very rough, very tough, very cruel, very ruthless, brutal, but Stalin left them all in the dust when it came to these characteristics. Trotsky was very tough guy himself and wanted to carry out a kind of revolution in the countryside, industrializing Russia in the process. But I think it's arguable, and most scholars would agree, that Stalin was the man who insisted on excesses, purging millions, including his own close colleagues. So this is a kind of uniqueness that I think we can say characterized Stalin. What about Khrushchev? We saw him standing there with his colleagues, Malenkov and the others. What would I cite to argue that Khrushchev was unique in this sense? Well, he did two things that I would argue no other Soviet leader in his peer group would have done. One was to denounce Stalin in the secret speech at the 20th Party Congress in 1956. Actually, there was one other leader who might have done it. That was Beria, because Beria had blood up to his armpits, and he was totally cynical, and he probably, had he not been arrested and liquidated, would have denounced Stalin in order to cleanse his own reputation. But he was gone, and none of the others, not Molotov, not Malenkov, not Voroshilov, would have done it. Why did he do it? I won't go into that. I try to explain that in my book. So one was the secret speech. The other was the Cuban Missile Crisis. I would argue, if I had more time, and I don't, that no other Soviet leader besides Khrushchev would have taken a harebrained step like that, sending those missiles to Cuba across 10,000 miles of open water, thinking that he could get away with it and nobody would notice it, setting them up in Cuba, hoping that the West, if anybody was looking, would mistake them for palm trees. Well, it didn't happen, and you know we got the Cuban Missile Crisis as a result. What about Gorbachev's uniqueness? Well, I would argue here that no other leader in his cohort would have done what he did, which was to carry out reforms that turned into a kind of peaceful revolution and, in effect, transformed communism and, in fact, in the end, destroyed it and led, not that he intended it, to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Okay, now it's the second characteristic of uniqueness that I think directs our attention to their character. Because if you are dealing with a leader who is unique in this sense, then it is legitimate to speculate that some of what they do, in fact much perhaps of what they do, traces back to some internal needs or internal compulsions that are driving them and pushing them forward. And I think that is the case with all three. In Stalin's case, what is the character? Well, I'm going to use one word, and it's a technical word, but you all know it: paranoia. Where it came from, how it manifested itself, but it was there, and it had a huge effect on life in the Soviet Union under Stalin. In Khrushchev's case, there actually is a technical term. I'll mention it, but I won't elaborate on it. It's hypomania, which the CIA, among others, concluded characterized Khrushchev. But to use less technical language, I would say he was impulsive, explosive, changeable, unpredictable, and all of this helps to explain how he behaved. When they kicked him out in October 1964, the term his successors devised for describing his reign was harebrained scheming, H-A-R-E, harebrained scheming, characteristic of what he did. In Gorbachev's case, again, I can't go into it, I don't have time, I don't have a technical term, but Gorbachev turns out to be a man who, compared to his peers, was extraordinarily idealistic, optimistic, trusting in his fellow men, both among his colleagues and in the society, to the point where he trusted them to help him build a democratic Soviet Union. Well, this then, it would be the case that all three of them have great power, that they are unique, that their character plays an important role, and that when they're gone, the door is open for change. I'll sort of close by saying a few words about how the characteristics of Khrushchev and Gorbachev then help to explain what happened after the period described in Josh's book. When Josh's book ends, as he just said, we have had evidence that Stalin's successors want to begin at least some process of liberalization, and that they want to ease the Cold War. And we have evidence that Churchill takes them seriously and wants to have talks, and Eisenhower is tempted to do so, and Dulles is against. Josh also says at the end that because of the East German uprising against the communist regime in East Berlin in the summer of 1953, some of those initial Soviet feelers begin to disappear as the regime realizes that its rule may be threatened in Eastern Europe and also by a kind of domino theory in the Soviet Union. So instead of taking chances on far-reaching change, either at home or abroad, instead they crack down, not to the degree that Stalin did, but to some degree, to kind of hold the whole empire together. Well, along comes Khrushchev, and what do we get? Khrushchev tries, in some ways, to resume the process of easing the Cold War. Again, there are many examples of this which I won't give you. But the result, ironically, is two of the Cold War's most hair-raising crises, the Berlin crisis and the Cuban crisis. So Khrushchev's effort to ease the Cold War produces an intensification and probably the greatest threat we've ever faced of nuclear war between East and West. And again, if I had more time, I'd try to talk about how that is to be explained. I guess I already hinted that in talking about how Khrushchev's uniqueness was to send these missiles to Cuba in a classic example of harebrained scheming. Then we get to Gorbachev, and as I've already said, here we get the complete transformation of communism, leading to the end of Soviet communism, although there does remain a Russian Communist Party, and we get the end of the Cold War. And I'm not saying, with reference to Gorbachev or Khrushchev or even to Stalin, that everything they do can be explained by their character, not at all. Of course, there are impersonal forces of all kinds, both at home, in their countries, and abroad, and what happens as a result of the interaction of all of these forces. But what I am saying is their individual characters have a decisive, well, I'll just say very, very important effect on what they do. And in Gorbachev's case, in my book, as I'll tell you more next September if the book ever makes it and you come back, what happens is this turns out to be a man who in his heart has become a social democrat rather than a communist. It's taken a long time. It doesn't reach fruition until probably something like 1989. But he's moving in that direction. He's wanting to democratize his country. He believes that what he's doing is in accord with Lenin's original aims of communism, which Stalin has perverted, and that needs to be left behind. He's trying to do this. He's trying to end the Cold War. He turns his back on Stalin's foreign policy and the ideology that underlines it. And he succeeds in the short run, but only to have the forces that he unleashes overwhelm him and lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union, which he never intended. And one might say, although I don't elaborate on this in the book, by a very indirect route, even eventually to the rise of Vladimir Putin, who in effect returns his country to something resembling, although not entirely, differing in many ways, to the Soviet system that Gorbachev has destroyed. So that's my effort to elaborate on Josh's wonderful story, and I'll stop here.
Thank you, Bill. We have time for questions, comments, objections. Yes, in the front.
You alluded to the fact that he was ill, and probably from his speeches that were 8 minutes instead of 8 hours.
We should give you this mic, if it's still working.
You alluded to the fact that he was ill for some time going up to the time that he died. I guess 2 questions. Do we know any more about his illness and why he died? And then he must have had some perception of realizing that he was not doing well.
Sure.
And did he have any indication of that he had some secession planning?
Okay, I'll answer. I hope you heard the question. First was, how ill was he leading up to his death in March '53, and did he have any plans for succession? The second's easy to answer. He did not. He did elevate Malenkov at the 19th Party Congress to give that speech, the address of the Central Committee, which Stalin always had given himself. So that was an indication that Malenkov was being anointed. But there was never anything official. There was no vice presidential role that in a succession crisis it would naturally point to one person. So with Stalin's death, in fact, before he died, but after his collapse, while he was dying for 4 days, they were already maneuvering. But they were determined to project an image of collective rule to reassure the population. Now, we believe that Stalin had begun during World War II, or right after World War II, to have some severe illnesses. And he may have had a heart attack, he may have had some small strokes. Svetlana believed he'd had a stroke or two after the war. He clearly had very high blood pressure, which there were no medications at that time, the way we have now, to treat it. He used to put iodine in hot water, which was a useless exercise in self-medication. His doctors had told him to stop smoking, which he apparently did in early '52. They told him to stop going to steam baths, which is a traditional Russian habit, because that would elevate his blood pressure. We believe Beria encouraged him to do that, maybe Beria for reasons of his own. But no, his doctors told Stalin in January, in January '52, that he should consider retiring. That was not a message he was going to hear. Stalin had a very severe stroke on sometime late in the day on March 1st, March 2nd, or in the early hours of March 2nd. He never recovered. Even if they had the most advanced medical care available, it would not have helped. He was treated with leeches, other traditional approaches, but he was beyond saving. And he died a natural death on the night of March 5th at around 9:50 p.m. His death was not announced until several hours later in the early morning.
Josh, can I add?
Yes, Bill.
There has been speculation that he was poisoned. I think that is not proven. But what is the case is that his colleagues came to his dacha after his bodyguards got up the courage to call for help, which took them about 8 hours because they didn't dare move into the room. They'd been told never enter the room without being summoned. And they saw his body on the floor. He was foaming at the mouth. He was sort of gurgling. And instead of calling doctors, they went away. And then only when they came back, several hours later, did they call doctors. So that was not murder, but it was sort of facilitation of death or something like that. Am I right about that?
Well, the bodyguards came in, then they called other Soviet leaders, and they did come, but then they claimed Stalin was sleeping.
Yes.
And he seemed to be snoring and said, "Why are you bothering us? There's nothing wrong with Comrade Stalin." But the guards understood this was a strange kind of sleep. And so later in the morning, very early, 6, 7 in the morning, they called again, and then doctors were summoned. So between the time he was discovered, late at night, say 10 p.m., the doctors did not actually arrive till like 7 or 8 in the morning. It's hard to think any of that would have mattered in his fate. But as to why they waited, all that is speculation, of course. Yes, Patrick.
Yes, in terms of the Eisenhower and Dulles dispute, and with it apparently getting resolved in favor of Dulles, is there much research as to how it came about that essentially Dulles' view prevailed over Eisenhower, and was it in any sense related to, that was really the period when the anti-communist hysteria was beginning, it was maybe just a little before McCarthy, but certainly the Alger-Dis. You had a variety of those things occurring. Plus, Eisenhower wanted to essentially get out of the Korean conflict, so which couldn't sit well with some of those factors.
Well, there's a great amount of literature on this period, the first months of Eisenhower's administration, and what to do about Stalin's death. I think it's clear that Eisenhower took the possibility of meeting the new Soviet leaders very seriously and toyed with it and discussed this with several of his advisors. That's on the record. It's also on the record that Foster Dulles was dead set against any negotiations. And one of Foster Dulles' main biographers, Townsend Hoops, has written that Stalin did Dulles the favor of dying. And Dulles returned the favor by pretending that Stalin hadn't died. Now, They opened serious they reopened serious negotiations over Korea at the initiative of the Kremlin. Within 2 weeks of Stalin's death, it was Soviet leaders who signaled to the Chinese and the Koreans who wanted to end the conflict that they were going to reopen negotiations. Stalin had wanted to prolong the conflict because it was bleeding the West. And he didn't care about Chinese casualties or Korean casualties. None of that mattered to him. But the Soviet leaders knew they had to defuse it. So this led to negotiations, and the armistice that was signed in the summer of '53 that rules the situation to this day. So we owe that to the Soviet leaders, not to Eisenhower and Dulles. So in my view, they missed an opportunity. But what could have been achieved is open to question. No one can say for sure what could have been achieved. But it seems clear to me that the new Soviet leaders were looking for a way to both move their own country in a more positive direction and relations with the West in a more positive direction, at least in that initial spring.
Just one quick additional comment, and that is that in retrospect, it's probably the case that not much could have been accomplished,
right,
if only because Stalin's successors were already fighting each other to succeed him, and would have taken advantage if one of them had been more concessive toward the West. And a similar thing happened with Khrushchev. Khrushchev, as I said, was trying to ease the Cold War and instead produced a crisis. And in retrospect, one can look back and say, was there a moment as he began to try to ease the Cold War when a more forthcoming Western attitude would have produced progress? But here I want to quote a famous Harvard government department professor, Adam Ulam,
yes,
who once described Khrushchev's approach to the West as, be my friend or I'll break your neck. And it's easy to understand how that kind of signal could be hard to understand.
Yes. Yes, Charlie.
What do we know
Please wait for the mic.
how Khrushchev was able to maneuver in that environment after Stalin's death and emerge on top?
Well, a great deal has been written about this by, among other people, Professor Taubman right here. Khrushchev wrote about this in dozens and dozens of pages in his own memoirs. If we are to believe him, while Stalin was dying, he already mentioned to Bulganin the need to do something with Beria, otherwise Beria would do something to them. And so throughout that spring, he was kind of very cautiously and very quietly approaching other members of the Politburo to gain their support for cashiering and eventually arresting Beria. Now, I want to emphasize he had to do this very carefully. Beria was the security chief. He controlled all communications in the country. He was monitoring their behavior, monitoring their meetings. He was the one in charge of eavesdropping equipment at that time, very rudimentary. He was in charge of the security details in the Kremlin. He was taken into custody in the Kremlin. And that they had to hide that fact from his own men who were securing security in the Kremlin. So it was a very ambitious, quiet, audacious project on Khrushchev's part.
In fact, this operation, which succeeded in eliminating Beria, is evidence of how shrewd and decisive and courageous Khrushchev could be. But on the other hand, I think what helped him prevail over the others in the battle to succeed Stalin was a rather different reputation that he had, which was that he was a kind of simple peasant. And I try to show in my book that going back into the 30s, Khrushchev played the fool in Stalin's court. And he played it very convincingly. And one reason he played it very convincingly was, in some ways, he was a fool. But, you know, I've actually seen newsreels. There's one famous scene in a newsreel. The leadership is standing on top of Lenin's tomb, which will soon be Lenin and Stalin's tomb, on a May Day. And Stalin is standing front looking absolutely grim. And Khrushchev comes sidling up from the back with his hat on a rakish angle and a big smile on his face, and he leans over, and there's no sound, but you are almost certain he's telling him something funny. He looks as if he's waiting for a smile, or none appears. But this is the way he carried on. He was the joker. And I think his rivals underestimated him in big time. Big league, as Trump would say.
Professor Alford mentioned I did a book on Ilya Ehrenberg. Ehrenberg used to refer to Khrushchev as Sancho Panza.
There you are. See?
Jill, you had a question. Wait for the mic.
Josh, could you say more about how the doctor's plot was eventually disavowed, and just very briefly, and what happened to the doctors?
The doctor's plot was announced on January 13th. Many doctors were already in jail. After Stalin took ill, several of the imprisoned doctors were approached for their opinions about how to help someone who had a severe stroke. Stalin dies. All we know is that on April 4th, an announcement was made in the Soviet press that the whole plot was a fabrication and that the doctors were being released. And then on April 6th, 2 days later, this was even elaborated on more in the Soviet press, that the fault lied with several security chiefs who had engaged in torture and other illegal methods to carry out the doctor's plot. Now, in my book, the doctor's plot is very opaque and remains opaque because very little information has been released, very little documentation has been released, and I go into this related fear that the Jews were going to be deported from the European cities of the Soviet Union to Central Asia, to Azerbaijan, to Siberia, which is this generic term we use for anything, east of Moscow. It's like, going to Wyoming. This, in my book, I actually write more about the disavowal and what it meant, because although it was unprecedented in the Soviet press for the Kremlin to admit a mistake, and a mistake of this caliber, of this scale, because if the doctors were innocent, Stalin was guilty. He was guilty of a far worse crime than what the doctors had been accused of. But none of that is spoken about in the Soviet press. So I go into some detail and some emotional heft, I would say, more on the disavowal in April than on the initial announcement of the doctor's plot in January. But the whole thing remains to this day an extremely opaque episode. We'll take one more question. I know we need to adjourn. Over here.
You mentioned missed opportunities, and you only know there's an opportunity there if there's intelligence telling you that there is that opportunity.
Sure.
And one thing that I'm wondering is, it was clear, in 1952, when Stalin had given just an 8-minute speech as opposed to a 5-hour speech, that his health was failing. Was the United States at all prepared for what was going to happen with Stalin? Did they have any ideas about who would be jockeying for power, who would be their horse in the race, so to speak, after Stalin's death?
Well, I can only tell you what Eisenhower said. In the days after Stalin collapsed, and even before he died, he's convening his closest advisors. National Security Staff, Vice President Richard Nixon, Foster Dulles, Allen Dulles, head of the CIA. And Eisenhower said to them, "Why are there no plans in the files? We knew this guy was old. We knew he was ailing. There are all kinds of reports about this illness and that illness which weren't always true." And in Eisenhower's words, it is criminal that we do not have plans in place to deal with this likely outcome. So they did not have anything really in place. They thought they could manipulate the new Soviet leaders, that they could engage in some kind of psychological warfare, that this could lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, there are all kinds of very uninformed illusions about how they could deal with the new Soviet leaders. And Eisenhower is expressing a great deal of frustration to his staff. But keep in mind, he had only come into office January 20th. And Stalin died 6-7 weeks later. And they were completely unprepared for this inevitable outcome. Thank you all very much. Books are in the corner.